Good afternoon, everyone. This talk has come about as a result of the experience of the Scottish Government in taking forward two plans. The first of which was our plan for offshore wind energy in Scottish territorial waters, which was published in March this year. And the second was the National Renewables Infrastructure Plan, which is focused on providing support for the construction and assembly of renewable devices in ports and harbours around Scotland. So both of them very spatial plans. And I was involved with the SEA and the HRA of both of them. And I was quite interested in looking at the intersections between the SEA and the HRA. So my purpose today is really to share that experience. I was doing some work as a result of that where I was exploring the links between SEA and HRA to see where we could work more efficiently and more proportionately. So I wanted to share that experience and tell you about some of the lessons that we learned. Maybe get some feedback from you on lessons you've had. You're particularly interested in the lessons from Ireland. So what I'm going to talk about, just give a quick overview on the two sets of processes, and then I'm going to go directly to the lessons learned so that we can talk about the key messages, and then talk about some of the key overlaps and divergences between the processes, depending on how we're doing for time. Okay? So let's get started. Before I start, just so that I know how with speed to go through, how many of you are familiar with the Habitats Regulations appraisal process or appropriate assessment? Okay, a second, go quickly. And I'm assuming you all know about SEA. Does anybody not know? Do I need to explain the steps a bit? No? Okay. Right. So just the background, I think you all know the Habitats Directive requires in Article 6.3 that we consider habitats. And I'll talk about that in a moment. So we've transposed that into our regulations, and those regulations ask specific questions. Is this plan directly connected with or necessary to the management of a European site for nature conservation? If it is, the plan can be adopted. If it isn't, you have to ask the question, is the plan likely to have a significant effect on a European site, either alone or in combination with other plans or projects? If the answer is no, then the plan can be adopted. If the answer is yes, or it's uncertain, if you are likely to have a significant effect, then you need to go further and ask more questions, making an appropriate assessment of the implications of the plan for the conservation objectives of the sites that are likely to be affected. And in the course of doing that, you consult the environmental authority, which in Scotland is the Scottish Natural Heritage, and if appropriate, the public. And then after that, you ask the question again, can you ascertain that the plan would not adversely affect the integrity of the European site? And if the answer is yes, it would not affect, the plan can be adopted. And if the answer is no, because there would be an adverse effect or it's uncertain, you change the plan, or in certain exceptional cases where there are no alternative solutions, and at the same time imperative reasons of overriding public interest, you can then start to look at compensatory measures. Okay? The reason I've gone through that in some detail is it sets out very specific tests that have to be answered to be legally compliant. And I think for those of you who were in the previous session, John mentioned this issue about legal compliance in the report review. So, Scottish Natural Heritage, in conjunction with others, have gone ahead and commissioned guidance on how to do the Habitats Regulations appraisal of plans, the effects of plans on Natura sites. And that's looking at it quite widely from the beginning, the time you begin and ask your questions to the time you get to the end. Okay, so it's not just the appropriate assessment. And what we've got here, the guidance was produced last year, wasn't it, Fiona? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the guidance sets out 13 steps, which naturally you can't read because it's too small. So I kind of summarized the key issues over here. The first question you ask is your plan subject to HRA or not? And then if it is, the first few steps are gathering the evidence base, what are your Natura sites, what are the interests, have you got mobile species, the usual kinds of questions. And doing your initial engagement with Scottish Natural Heritage and any other stakeholders you want to bring into the process. There's no requirement to do that. And then this is a two-step process. Once you've got your baseline, the information you need, there's a screening process where you're looking at the plan saying, is the plan likely to have a significant effect on a Natura site or its interests? If it is, can you build in mitigation into that plan by changing the plan or putting in mitigation measures so that you can avoid an adverse effect on that site? So the whole focus of this screening process is to build in mitigation until you can say no significant effect. If you get to a point where you can't do that, you then need to go into your appropriate assessment, where very often you're looking for additional mitigation measures. And then that's finished off by the reporting process. Okay, so this whole guidance document, the link was on the previous slide. I can give it to anybody who wants it later afterwards. Sets out in step-by-step detail the key issues, why things are being done the way they're done, setting out the case law, rationale, and so on, so that you can get hopefully to that point, but if not, to this point. Okay? Is everybody with me so far? So there's a baseline information, screening, appropriate assessment, reporting, and the main, in summary, the main steps. Obviously slightly more complicated than that, but in 15 minutes we don't have time. And you're familiar with SEA, so you know we have the directive. And these are the steps. So I was looking at the steps in the HRA process, and then looking at the steps in the SEA, looking for areas of overlap and areas of divergence. And one key thing that we found was in the timing of the work that we were doing for both the plans that I was involved with. The SEA was undertaken as part of the development of the draft plan, and the environmental report was published alongside the draft plan when it went out for consultation, which is a requirement. But the HRA was undertaken after that consultation was done. It was undertaken as a separate process before the plan was adopted. And the results of both the SEA and the HRA were taken into account in the adoption of the offshore wind plan. Okay, the National Renewables Infrastructure Plan is subject to adoption procedures. And in summary, I'll just go straight to the key messages. With SEA and HRA, there are opportunities to combine those two processes, particularly when you're looking at the early stages of the work. And there's good opportunities for parallel working or for combining, doing one piece of work to satisfy two requirements. And the key areas of that are in the collection of the baseline information, because you need the baseline information on Natura sites for both processes. In terms of the assessment of the effects, because again, you're thinking about the effects on the Natura sites and their qualifying interests. So the issue of effects is actually very similar. Avoidance of effects, because thinking back to that diagram I showed you, that the whole thrust of HRA is to avoid effects on plans. And with avoidance at the top of the mitigation hierarchy, that's what we're trying to do in SEA as well. A key issue as well is the identification of mitigation measures, because you have to have consistency between the mitigation measures that are in your SEA and the mitigation measures that are in your HRA. And I know that doesn't sound like rocket science, but sometimes getting coordination when you're running two parallel processes at different times can be quite a challenge. And the other thing you can do is you can combine a lot of the consultation at early stages, because we're always working towards early engagement with the various authorities. And again, I think someone in one of the earlier sessions made a reference to, using integrated assessment to avoid consultation fatigue and environmental assessment fatigue generally. And again, it's not a new message. Try and put your consultation processes together if you can. And by doing this, we're looking to ensure consistency between the SEA and the HRA. And as always, we're looking to achieve efficient and proportionate working, particularly in today's climate, where we're needing to streamline and it used to be do more with less. I think now we're doing less with less. We're doing much more with less. In terms of the key differences in that integration, one of the key issues is you've got differences in your significance tests, and that was why I was talking through the wording of the directive. Because in SEA, we're looking at more general, potential significance. Very often you're thinking about the value of the receptor, the potential impact on that. But in HRA, your significant tests are prescribed by the legislation, and they use precise terminology, which is most unwise to deviate from. We've talked quite a bit amongst ourselves about whether you can report the two processes together. And there's nothing to stop you from doing that as long as you use the right terminology so that you are legally compliant. On the whole, our advice is to report separately, to maybe use bits of the process to work together, but to report separately to avoid that kind of confusion. But you don't have to. You just have to make sure that your reporting is very clear. And again, another thing that I found is that you're taking the same information, but you're using it at different points in the process. So, for example, when you're screening an SEA, you're at a very early stage and you're speaking quite generally. You're not really identifying the mitigation measures until you're at the environmental assessment part of your process. But in HRA, you're using mitigation measures at the screening stage when you're trying to avoid effects before you move to the appropriate assessment. How am I doing for time?
You've got about 3 minutes.
Thanks. So in terms of the lessons learned from these plans, we're working with the same baseline, but we're applying different tests. We need to plan to coordinate the two processes so that you've got communication and liaison between the folk who are doing it, and also, consistency in mitigation measures. You're using the same baseline information. You're talking about the same effects. Consistency between the two, and that requires communication and coordination. In terms of the timing of the assessments, I think the key lesson has been for us is to start the HRA early alongside the SEA. Use the HRA as part of the plan development process rather than a post hoc checking process where you might need to go back and change the plan. These are old lessons that we had from the EIA days. Ensure that you have appropriate treatment of biodiversity in your SEA reporting. In the offshore wind plan, quite a few of the Natura issues were parked for the HRA, and it didn't give you a proper overview. I mean, in SEA terms, you're talking about Natura and wider biodiversity issues. In HRA, it's only Natura, okay? But you still need to report it properly in your HRA, so you can use your HRA to do the work and then report it more generally in the SEA reports if that's how you want to run it. Okay? And then again, this issue about consultation practices, we realized early engagement is very key, and we're going for much wider consultation. So these lessons that we've learned are all being applied to our next marine plan, which is the sectoral marine plan for wave and tidal in Scottish territorial and offshore waters. And so I'll have a chance to test this and hopefully report back on the success or otherwise of this in Portugal. Okay, I think I'll just stop.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good time. We'll start making some up. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Amanda? Go ahead.
Just a quick one. With a plan or programme level effects regulations assessment, if you get to the point where you decide you can't discount potentially significant effects on the European side, if you adopt that plan and it goes forward, is that as far as it goes at the plan level, or do you have to start rehearsing Iroquois type arguments at the plan level?
Yes, you do. You have to start reversing Iroquois, because the key issue is if you have a plan that then has potentially significant effects on a Natura site, and the next level of the plan or project, if that plan or project, say you're talking about a structure plan, a strategic development plan, which is then the detail of which is determined at a lower level of planning or where you have a project. If that plan or project could not be taken forward because of the issues in your plan, you would be culpable, right? You're not facilitating. If you need to know where you've got significant effects that cannot be mitigated or avoided, and if you're going to invoke the Iroquois, given the amount of time involved in that, you need to do it at a higher level stage.
I'm guessing what I'm saying is that with a lot of plans and programs, the sort of envelope of uncertainty is quite large.
That's right.
At the time.
Yeah.
And if you implemented the plan in a certain way, you wouldn't have an effect. If you implemented it in another way, you might.
Well, that's where these mitigation measures come in as screening, because what you're doing is making commitments about how the plan will be implemented. You're starting a green thread running right through to the next level of planning if you're in a planning hierarchy, or down to project implementation.
What's the movie?
Imperative reasons of overriding public interest.
Is there anybody else? Any comments to make? Okay, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon everybody, and thanks to Amanda because she has set the context for my presentation. What I'm going to try to do through this presentation is go very quickly through a methodological approach we're developing in Ireland to exactly do a similar thing to what the Scottish government is doing. It's integrated SEA and SEA Biodiversity Impact Assessment. The project is funded by the Environmental Protection Agency. It's a collaboration between two universities, University College Dublin and Trinity College Dublin, and a consultancy, Scott Colley, who are specialised in preparing appropriate assessment reports and other ecological studies. So we got a very practitioner-oriented approach in developing this methodology. We're not trying to come up with something that is idealistic, but something that is practical and applicable. The project started in April, so we're halfway through there, and let me tell you now before I go move forward, everything that I'm going to be showing to you today, it's at a preliminary stage. We're holding a consultation, a national consultation workshop in October the 7th, so nobody in Ireland has really seen it yet. You're the first ones to see it, so I'll be very, very keen on getting any constructive criticism, any feedback from you, because it's going to help us prepare as well for that workshop, and it'll be obviously very good to have an international perspective of what we're proposing to do. As I said, the objective is integrating procedures, and we're focusing mainly on SEA and appropriate assessment, but we're also looking at other biodiversity-related legal requirements, down to IAIA, Water Framework Directive, Environmental Liability Directive, Floods Directive, and other pieces of legislation like that. And the whole aim is to, we haven't come to that point yet, but I think the whole idea is to produce a manual, practical manual for practitioners to help them coordinate efforts when they're trying to integrate the different requirements. So it's not only looking at how this should be done, which Amanda has explained quite well, and I'm going to go through some of those points again, but it's also to develop specific techniques and coordination between the different parties, methods to get them improve consultation procedures and sort of data collection and sharing, among other things. The whole project is based on the foundations of biodiversity conservation and protection. By looking at this piece of legislation, we can argue that they have a broadly similar objective in terms of protection of flora and fauna and the wider biodiversity aspects. Now, each procedure is currently giving a very fragmented picture of biodiversity. So if we can try and achieve this integration, we think we can provide a much more comprehensive picture of an assessment of biodiversity a comprehensive overview of potential biodiversity impacts, basically. And we can also improve the effectiveness of the individual procedures. So there's an opportunity there. We also think that some of the methodological steps actually overlap quite well, and Amanda actually showed us some of that already. However, some of the requirements in terms of the species we're looking at or habitat types, etc., are quite different. We all know that appropriate assessment is only looking at Natura 2000 sites, so it's quite narrow in the scope of the assessment. Biodiversity in SEA is looking at not just Natura 2000 sites, but other national designations. In our law we have natural protection areas, for example, red listed species, flora protection orders, etc., etc. So SEA will look at the wider biodiversity issues, and not just designated sites, but also non-designated areas, and likes of water features and other kind of stepping stones, elements that connect biodiversity and make it possible, make it happen. So we've been looking at all those aspects. We've been looking obviously at the legal requirements, but also at all the other practicalities. And what we've done to simplify matters, or to simplify the development of methodology and the explanation or the development of the formulation of recommendations, I suppose, is group them according to the level of overlap. And we come up with something like this. This is a simplified version of something that I'm trying to do. Is quite complex already, okay? But I'm going to go one by one to address the different issues. That's basically showing the different steps in each of the procedures. I'm focusing on SEA and appropriate assessment, but I'm also bringing IAIA into the game because it does clearly link with the two processes. So if I were to look at the grouped steps, what we've done is amalgamate the screening and scoping to start with, because the screening and scoping stages of SEA and EIA can be somehow combined with AIA screening. In this particular initial step, we think that because appropriate assessment has a statutory authority to withhold consent, appropriate assessment should lead the process. So basically a bit what Amanda is saying, that the HRA should come together with SCA. We're actually suggesting that it starts slightly before the SCA process, so it's bringing to the forefront. For the simple reason that if AIA screening identifies any potential issues that might lead to withholding consent, the plan or program should go back to the drawing board and reconsider it. There's no point in continuing SCA if you already know that from the appropriate assessment point of view, the plan is not gonna be approved. So this kind of grouped step, the appropriate assessment screening will highlight any of those issues and define whether the plan should move forward in its current form. As I said, if not, you go back to it, and then whenever all those appropriate assessment issues have been dealt with, we move on to the next stages of SCA. In this context, appropriate assessment screening findings and any potential issues on to whether IROP might be involved or not should be considered in SCA and EIA. Now, if that is not the case, if appropriate assessment doesn't identify any of those issues, or if those issues have been dealt with by reconsidering the plan or program, you can then move on to the baseline environment of SCA and to the next stage of screening. So they can happen together by looking at the qualifying interest of designated sites as part of appropriate assessment, and by looking at the other environmental aspects considered within the SCA framework. In here, we think that the appropriate assessment information, as Amanda has already pointed out, should be taken into account in SCA, but also SCA findings should inform appropriate assessments. And I'll come back to this in the impact assessment stage. Now, in the definitional alternatives, we found out that things get a bit more complicated, and I think, I don't know if this works the same way in Scotland, but we have a stage 3 procedure. So if you go through appropriate assessment and you find that you have issues, you come up with alternatives in stage 3, and these alternatives are sort of ecological solutions, which tends to work as mitigation, really. So there's a bit of a timing lag in between the appropriate assessment alternatives and the SCA or EIA alternatives. At SCA and EIA level, alternatives are considered before you actually do the assessment. in appropriate assessment. This happens after you do the appropriate assessment. In any case, we think it's very, very important that there is communication and coordination between the teams to make sure that any alternatives that might derive from the appropriate assessment procedure are also assessed and taken into account into the SEA procedure. Or alternatively, to have the ecologist involved within the SEA team when developing the alternatives for the plan to make sure ecological considerations are brought in into the SEA alternatives. Then in the assessment of potential impact, we think that again it's just very important to have communication between the two processes and to coordinate expertise and efforts in terms of data gathering and impact assessment techniques or methods. We think appropriate assessment can bring a lot to the SEA by highlighting the qualifying interest within sites, and when specific surveys are undertaken as part of AEA, they should obviously be used in SEA as well. But the other way around too, because appropriate assessment has such a narrow scope and we're only looking at within the boundaries of designated sites, somehow it falls short of considering other relevant aspects, such as connectivity between those sites. Those sites will not be sustainable, will not be able to sustain themselves if it wasn't for other stepping stones, for example. And that is we think that's something that is overlooked in the current appropriate assessment procedure. So SEA could actually complement appropriate assessment, but by basically looking at by basically integrating the findings of the impact assessment and looking at things like connectivity between stepping stones or how water features, climate, etc., are affecting those designated sites. And in the last group step, we're looking at mitigation and monitoring. And mitigation has already been said. Mitigation measures has to be compatible between the two processes and have to be considered simultaneously for incorporation in the plan and program or project in that case. Now, appropriate assessment does not formally require monitoring arrangements to be set. But again, the two things can integrate each other and improve by being integrated if Natura 2000 indicators were to be specifically incorporated into SEA monitoring arrangements and procedures. So that's basically the overview of recommendations we're making. Obviously, there is overarching recommendations that not recommendations, but issues we looking at and we're trying to address. The statutory framework is clearly has to be looked into, because currently the different consent procedures have their own legal framework, and they all in Ireland, for example, I think John will touch a bit more on that. The habitat regulations are just being reviewed. I don't know if they've been published yet.
They might be while we're away.
Sometime this week where it was happening. But they actually introduced a new clause to see if there was a situation whereby different appropriate assessments were to be undertaken. Correct me if I'm wrong. There is a clause there that says that you can set one single leader or one single consent authority for all procedures instead of having different consent procedures for the different processes.
There's half a page in the regulations which say, if necessary, the various bodies will coordinate.
Yeah, so it's things like that we also looking at, obviously. Very important to Mike and Amanda has already pointed out, the whole communication and consultation has to be coordinated. We think it's very, very important to, and I know the girl that was here this morning and I kind of attacked her with a question of, did you do the consultation internally? But you did, it was a communication within the consultancy or with other consultancies. Sometimes it's quite difficult to actually get to talk to other consultancies due to whatever commercial issues, time issues, etc., etc. But it's very important, and not just between the different teams preparing these reports or undertaking these assessments, but also with data providers, with the proponent, and obviously with the consent authority. You need to coordinate timeframes. We think it's very important as well to bring in the ecologist input into the whole SEA process, so the ecologists have to take a bit more of a lead if this integration is to happen. And then we're dealing with all data and information sharing in Ireland. We have the National Biodiversity Data Centre, kind of semi-governmental body that is trying to bring in together into a single website all the biodiversity relevant data sets. We as part of the project as well bringing in additional data sets coming from other organizations to do with likes of climate or water or soils that are also supporting biodiversity. And we think that we need a centralized kind of database where people, consultants could actually access the relevant information on one go, because time is precious when it comes to all these assessment procedures. Moreover, the EIA type surveys are never shared. I created them, they're mine, they're kept into that project or put on a file, but they're not shared, and there's a lot of duplication of efforts. So we're trying to look into that as well. And then this is, again, it's very preliminary, and there's internal debate within the team, so I'd like to hear your views on it. We're considering including a recommendation to have a common reporting procedure, what we call the IBIS, which stands for Integrated Biodiversity Impact Statement. Now, there is concerns about this being an additional reporting tool. There's concerns about this, this is an additional burden. Okay, thank you. But it's a way of maybe amalgamating findings, and it could either replace SDA biodiversity, flora and fauna section and Natura impact statements, but it could be presented as standalone document. Very quickly, I don't have time. We have taken a GIS spatial approach, the whole methodology. So in those groupings, we're looking at different techniques of how spatial data and GIS could support and screen and scoping, thematic mapping, basic mapping. In terms of impact assessment, is obviously looking at the composite biodiversity sensitivities within an area against the proposed alternatives and see if there is any conflicts. And then by undertaking this spatial analysis, you're obviously helping to define especially specific mitigation and monitoring measures. Again, I don't have time to go into this, but in taking that GIS approach, we've encountering a lot of difficulties in terms of geographical scope, and this is worth highlighting. In SCA, you generally look at the assessment within site boundaries, that would be the plan boundary or the project boundary. Sometimes you look at transboundary issues as well, but generally within an administrative boundary, while in AEA you have the governmental guidelines in Ireland recommend a 15-kilometre buffer around the proposed plan. So it's quite several discrepancies or divergences there, and in terms of assessment detail, data collection levels, so there's different requirements between the different procedures. So we're trying to address those. Just final remarks. Just finding very difficult to amalgamate procedures from the legislative point of view, and from the practical point of view, difficulties deal with or have to do with the scope of the assessment, the availability of the data sets, their quality and the scale of application, and the actual assessment techniques, because they're quite different in current practice. Nevertheless, we think that an integrated procedure to biodiversity impact assessment could increase the efficiency of individual procedures just by coordinated efforts, increasing the communication channels and the way communication is maintained at the moment, and also sharing data. That's very much it. Sorry I was a bit rushed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for another interesting presentation. Are there any questions anyone would like to put to her?
Criticize it, please. Criticize my recommendations.
Must be getting late. People are switching off, aren't we?
So is this meant to be for terrestrial-based plans or all?
For all plans, in principle, yeah. We're looking also marine.
Because I think it might depend on different circumstances, but we've been finding, even with SCA land use plans, we have to think about cross-border issues between administrations and that kind of thing. But also for the HRA side of things, we're using 100 kilometre because of the issue of micro birds, and just because it's benefits from the vast have been found bring the water to Columbus. So the 100
glad that you mentioned that the 15-kilometre buffer is recommended for terrestrial assessments
So
because
because
the
it has
Irish
we have to go to the
renewable
full
energy, the Irish offshore renewable energy strategy consider a wider, much wider buffer zone. Yeah. So, want to take into
I
account.
think it depends on the plan and what you're proposing, and the nature of your resource sets as well.
Okay, anybody else?
A very short question. This methodology is very interesting. Has it been based on any concrete examples, or you have implemented it, tested it somehow, and then
It's part of the project to have a test run of the methodology. It's going to be one of the recommendations. It hasn't been applied as such, but it's based on a lot of factual evidence because the consultants that are involved in the process are very much aware of what's happening. They're very high experts in the matter, and we've done a significant review of some SEA and EIA type appropriate assessments. There's no bias.
The SEA side of it, she's not going to blow her own trumpet, grew out of that, Ainhoa's own previous contract with the EPA to deliver a GIS linked SEA methodology.
I think we have one more question over in the corner.
Ingrid in the host. Do you have in mind who is going to do this in real life?
Practitioners.
Yeah. Consultants or
Consultants.
staff?
Well, it all depends because in SCA, a lot of the SCA has been undertaken in-house at the moment by local authorities. So presumably there'll be users of this methodology as well by bringing in an ecology expert into the team. So.
Do you have, Brian Jenkins from New Zealand, do you have any issues with data compatibility? Are there data protocols so that all of the data sets can actually be put on a common database?
As I said, I've been liaising and talking to the guy that is behind the National Biodiversity Data Centre, and there are issues. There are scale issues, there are confidentiality issues, there is a lot of issues like that. So, I don't know, that centre has been working for the last 5 years and hopefully work for many more, but it's kind of an early stage, and they have collected a lot of information but not all. Now we propose them already to see whether they'll be willing to take EIA surveys into their database, and they are. So at least they are proactive about it. Yeah.
Historically, the biggest incompatibility has been between those you have to pay for and those you can get free.
Yeah. Well, and there's a lot of scale issues as well. At the level they actually, when you see the information on the website, some of they kind of standardize everything to grid cells, and some of them are 10 square kilometers, some of them are down to 100 meters per square kilometer. So it depends on the data set. Really.
Okay, just last question now. Look at that.
There's a lady there as well. Who was taking you. Yeah.
Okay. Monica Kraber from Reuters Slovenia. I'm not really a data freak, but I think data, baseline data and their availability are very important for timescale. And
Sorry,
for timescale of any of the assessments that you showed how you try to integrate them, because the biodiversity assessment, the appropriate assessment has the precautionary principle. So I guess if you don't have the data, you have to explore, you have to do the assessments, and that's bound to vegetation seasons and so on. How did you consider the time scale when you sort of tried to merge the procedure?
That's a good point.
SCA can be done in a much quicker way, or EIA as well. Sometimes for appropriate assessment you need much more time to do the research.
Yeah. I haven't really looked into that in depth, but it's interesting you said that, because talking to ecologists there last week, one of the issues that was raised is that because of the current economic situation and everyone wants everything done cheap and quick, a lot of consultancies are finding themselves on having to do surveys in the middle of winter when flora and fauna are not there. So, and that obviously leads to the wrong answers and the wrong outputs of the assessment. but it will be addressed in our guidelines as recommendations that obviously seasonal variation has to be taken into account. The other thing that relates to that is that National Biodiversity Data Center I'm telling you about, they got something like 10 million records. It's just unreal the amount of data they managed to put together. But some of those records date from the 1920s, so they're very, very old historical records. Now you might have a species in a given place and then you go there and it's not there anymore, so there's a lot of kind of ground truthing to be done with that. But interestingly enough, in their website, when you look at it, they give you the records and they give you then a graph with the surveys and indicate when the majority of surveys were done. So you can see that maybe a lot of the data is historical data and is obsolete. So it's down to the ecologists to interpret that information and say, well, we can rely on this information or not, and we need to do additional surveys or not.